Good morning.
Morning.
It's April. You wouldn't know it, but the apple blossoms have come on the apple tree here in the back. Really beautiful. This morning I'd like to speak a little bit about breath. And I titled this talk, A Free Spirit, because the word spirit and breath come from the same origins. And I think our tendency when we take up a spiritual practice, particularly one that has a kind of yogic quality, meaning there's a practice to do, that there's a tendency to take up something like practicing with the breath as a technique, and this reverberates with our tendency to dominate, our tendency to see spiritual practice as an opportunity to get control over something, as opposed to an opportunity to meet something in a more profound level. And so free spirit, free breathing, this is the kind of inquiry that I'm interested in when we study breath through the practice of Zazen. Now, this tendency for us to ignore or dominate is not just our tendency with breath, but is very pronounced with breath. Our tendency is to either say, well, this is something which is unimportant, therefore not worthy of my attention. We're not thinking that all through, but it's in our attitude. Or something is important, and in what way can I craft a circumstance in which that thing could be captured in one way or another, either literally or metaphorically. So we can study that basic tendency, that basic karmic dynamic within ourselves when we study breath. Our tendency to either ignore or to dominate. Dominate can look like pushing something away, or it can look like pulling something closer and controlling it. But even though we have that tendency to ignore or dominate, the breath is here. It's ungraspable, it's patient, it's constant, and even with our kind of unskillful karma that we bring to meeting things, including the breath is there. Is there to teach us. There's an invitation in breath, a very intimate invitation. Actually, there's an intimate invitation in the meeting of all or any phenomena, or each phenomena. But this invitation that breath brings us, because we know breath is such this constant, close thing, that it has a special quality and a special place within the practice of Zazen. In fact, when we teach Zazen here at Buddha-Ai Temple, we use a very traditional model of teaching Zazen where we talk about the postures. If you had Zazen instruction here, your Zazen instructor probably talked about the three postures, the posture of body, and the posture of breath, and the posture of mind. So breath is a whole facet of what we talk about when we're taking up this practice of Zazen. This intimate invitation of breath is an invitation to live beyond greed, hate, and delusion as the anxious centers of our being. So much anxiousness now. I mean, with humans, probably it has always been the case that there's a lot of anxiousness. But it's very high now. The irony doesn't escape me that breath is the invitation to a different possibility. It's also the center of the pandemic that we've been experiencing for the past year and a half, year and some change, whatever it is. Wearing a mask, concerned about what will move through breath. It's disturbing us on a really deep level. So this intimate invitation to live beyond greed, hate, and delusion as the anxious center Again, all phenomena actually are giving us this invitation, but breath does it in a very beautiful and particular way. So this morning, as I start these teachings on breathing, the first thing I want to talk about is why practice with the breath rather than how to practice with the breath. Now, the two overlap with each other. But if we understand more deeply a Buddhist approach to non-domination and non-ignoring, we also call this attention or awareness or mindfulness. If we understand something about why it is presented in that way, or what is this breath practice about, then when we get into the how to do it, we come with a different kind of a spirit, rather than the, oh, okay, great, I got another technique, I can employ it to lead myself beyond all my problems. Or to cultivate a particular state of mind. So this is one thing when we talk about working with the breath. There are many, many practices that look very similar, but actually are very different. You know, we say meditation, for example. Meditation is like a really, really broad word. It encompasses all kinds of things, some of which are really diametrically opposed in their intent to other things that look like meditation. People just sitting there quietly, you know, maybe their hands are like this, or like this, or like this. That's all we can see is different, but the intention with which a person is engaging in that and the type of practice they're taking up could be really, really different. Right? So I want to clarify a little bit about why I think breath practice is so important and why it is so inviting, and the possibility for it to help us move beyond that clutch at the center of our being where we're clutching down and we're quite nervous about it. Now, if we talk about greed, hate, and delusion, which is always the medicine which the Buddhist teachings is trying to, or the medicine is always trying to be applied to these. They're called the three poisons. Delusion, greed, and hate. Delusion is like the perceptual basis of greed and hate. We enact a life that is pushing and pulling, right? Because we fundamentally have bought into the idea that life is about subject and object. I'm a subject and I'm in a world of objects. Fundamentally buying into that distinction, an essential buy-in to that subject-object world, that's what Buddhism calls delusion. Right? That it seems that way to us, seems very obviously that way to us, but that is not how things are essentially. They are created that way, right? Through the way that our consciousness is unfolding. It's an ignorance or a delusion about the fundamental interconnectedness, that all phenomena that arise interdependently or mutually. There's no such thing as a phenomena that arises just on its own. It's always together with other things. In the ultimate sense, we would say with all other things. When Buddhism says this delusion, that we think that I'm a subject and there are objects, that there are these individual things that are independent of each other, that are kind of running into each other. That when we buy into that, it becomes very natural for us to then live a life that's animated by trying to pull the things closer to us that we believe that we need and trying to push away the things that are problematic. And that fundamental dynamic of greed and hate, sometimes people would say like a clinging and aversion, there's different words for it, but that fundamental dynamic is very unsettling. That we feel anxious all the time because we're worried about the stuff that we grabbed onto is maybe it will go away, and the stuff that we're trying to hold at bay, it may show up. So the Buddhist teachings are trying to invite us into an exploration, or trying to invite us into a vision which is not so bifurcated. It's not so split into that way of seeing the world. When we hear the woodpecker, you know, we had a lot of woodpeckers this year around the temple, you know. Is the woodpecker inside? Is the woodpecker outside? It's really hard to tell. I don't mean there's like some big philosophical questioning here? I mean, just in the experience of woodpeckerness, duck, 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 and it's so enlivening. Your life is enriched, or life is enriched because of that emergence of a phenomena, which has everything to do with your hearing. It has everything to do with the pecking. My neighbor showed me the other day where those little sapsuckers are coming and making this series of holes in her lilac to suck out the sap. It can lead us to all kinds of delightful discoveries. Buddhism also says that this delusion is beginningless. It's not your fault that you see things this way. Right? That's not the point. The point is just to see, that quality of consciousness, we can't really locate a beginning to it. We don't know where it started. We don't need to know where it started. It's actually not important to know where it started. Right? It's beginningless. But we have some option, right? Rather than simply operating on the basis of that delusion, we can investigate something more fundamental about our experience. Okay? Now, aspiration, right? The spirit moving in and out of our body as breath. This is an excellent place to investigate this, to investigate this delusion, to see how it doesn't really hold up. Just think about when you're sitting and you're feeling your breath. Do you breathe? Is that you doing that? If it is, then what happens when you're not paying attention and you're still breathing? Who's doing that? Or are you breath? Or are you breathed? These are things that we encounter very directly in meditation, where if you sit and things settle down a little bit, it can be a real question. Am I breathing? Am I breathed? Is there breath because I'm alive, or I'm alive because I'm breathing? That distinction between things where one becomes a subject and the other an object is really hard to hold on to if we let the mind relax around subject and object split a little bit. Breath is a perfect place to do this. We use the word awareness. We use words mindfulness. One of the reasons I don't like to leave it just at that, like just pay attention to your breath, is it's so easy for our dominating spirit to take over that instruction and say, okay, I'm going to pay attention to my breath now. Okay, I'm doing meditation right, because I'm paying attention to my breath. Or when I forget about my breath, then I'm like, I'm meditating wrong. We get in these head trips, right, about I'm going to do something with my breathing, which is just that subject-object split, right? Now you've invited it right into the depths of your belly. Or it's already there. But now you're holding it tight there in the depths of your belly. But this exploration, we can say, okay, this subject-object split, this basic kind of bifurcation that I'm buying into all the time, what's going on with the breath? And these interesting questions emerge. Are you doing it, or are you receiving it? Are you doing it, or are you receiving it? Dogen Zenji calls the upright sitting of Zazen the samadhi of receiving and employing the self. Jiju Zambai. Receiving and doing. The self receiving and doing. The self receiving and doing the self. The self of receiving and doing. The receiving and the doing of self. I mean, you can play with the words. They're Chinese characters. There's 3 of them. But the concentration, that's what he calls Zazen, the concentration or samadhi of receiving and doing self. This is a kind of koan. This is a kind of a invitation. You can't figure it out with your rational mind. I mean, you could come up with a very elaborate description or explanation of what Dogen Zenji is getting to there, and that would be fine, especially if you were a scholar and you wanted to write. There's wonderful things to learn from that. But right in meditation, you're studying that, automatically by taking the upright seat, which you have received by seeing others do it, by seeing a concrete Buddha, perhaps, in a garden. You say, oh, I could sit like that. So you receive something and you're doing it. Breath, this is happening with breath all the time. Now, it takes a lot of energy to keep this doing and receiving isolated from each other in our heart. It takes a lot of energy. And we all, I don't want to say we gladly use the energy, but we just do. We using that energy all the time to keep this separation between the doing and the receiving. It takes a lot. And that's right there in that core of anxiousness, that we feel like our life just never is quite settled. Because we're holding these two apart. Oh, I did it. I did this thing, or I received this thing. But breath is inviting us into an investigation of where the doing and the receiving is not so clearly held apart. And there's a great relief in that. So in breath practice, one of the things we do, as later on, probably next week when I start talking a little bit about breath practices, that's the core here, to deeply appreciate. Of course I'm breathing, I'm involved here, and I'm receiving something. And I don't have to hold those two apart. When I activate that and I embody that with my breath, there is a great relief. And you can feel it. There's a way, when we talk about, use a breath practice to calm down or to stay centered. Well, that's not just because of the way the oxygen is or the way that your brain waves are changing. That's all part of it. But there's a fundamental spiritual thing happening there. There's something at stake about how it is that we view the world that is shifting when we care for our breath in that way. Because life itself is inseparable, the inseparability of receiving and doing. That's what life is. That's that woodpecker, right? Where you feel something alive. When I was writing the notes for my talk this morning, I kept flashing on this experience I had. It was in my mid-20s. I had this van. I was living in Japan, and I had this van, a minivan. It was a really minivan. Our minivans aren't mini. These minivans are really mini. They're like, 10 feet long and 5 feet wide or something. And I love, that was my favorite car ever. And it has a 500cc engine. So, to get up a hill, it has a turbo in it. It was 4-wheel drive. I had almost bald tires, but I could just ride. I could go in the snow and everything all over the place. It was great. Anyway, so I was thinking about this van, but I wasn't just thinking about the van. I was thinking about when I had to change the clutch. Didn't have any money, very little, and so it wasn't going to work out to have someone else change the clutch. So my friend is a motorcycle mechanic, and he helped me. And so we bought the parts, and I was there working on this thing. It was pouring rain. We had to put this tarp over top of it because we didn't have a garage to put it in or anything, and it was lifted up, and oh my gosh, it was so hard. I couldn't fit my fingers in the between stuff because it's all so mini, so like it couldn't get up to where the bolts were and everything. Anyway, so I was working on this car, and a lot of lessons came from that. But one of them, my good buddy who was helping me, his landlord used to be a car mechanic. And he came home from work. He has a business now where they do road construction and that kind of thing. He came back from work, and he came over to see how we were doing, Shoji-san. And he looked underneath the car like this, and he looked at me, and he was sort of smiling. I was like, what's going on, Shoji-san? He said, Patrick, that's my birth name. I wasn't ordained yet. He said, cars are very honest things. And I knew exactly what he meant. It's like, you can't try to trick your way through this one. All of your extra you're doing it, and you're trying to make it happen. He could see how frustrated I was and how everything was kind of, and he had learned that cars are very honest things. That actually, if you're going to work on a car, you're receiving something from the car. You're not just doing, right? It gives you something very stable, usually made out of steel or rubber. Right? And it presents itself to you just exactly as it is. And when you're unable to receive that, the doing gets really hard, right? So you're trying to fit your, and then the wrench slips and you bang your hand on the transmission and cut your hand open. All those kinds of things that can happen. Right? Receiving and doing. So when he told me that, it was just like something just kind of like dropped off my body. I sort of laughed at myself a little bit, and then I worked much more, and I got it all together, and then I turned it on, and it wasn't centered. And no one had taught me, don't put in all the other stays before you turn the engine over, so then I had to take several hours taking it all apart again, too. So I got really like deep familiarity with the honesty of my car. But think about the things that you love. How about gardening? What would gardening be if you could just do it? Oh, it would suck. Right? Gardening is receiving and doing. You're receiving that. My wife really likes the hellebore, those, what are they, Christmas roses, people call them sometimes, Without the honesty and the generosity of the hellebore, there wouldn't be any gardening, right? It'll just be making something you want. I don't know, spray painting the concrete green to pretend like it's the grass or something. Mm-hmm. Growing vegetables. There's such magic in it. There's such magic. And there's magic in it because it's not just doing, it's receiving and doing. Raising children, for those of you who have been honored to do that. I mean, if you think you're just going to do it, you're just going to raise them, good luck. You're going to do damage, and you're going to be damaged. Raising is definitely receiving and doing. If it's only receiving, then you don't practice your generosity. You don't practice your participation. You have to be present. You have to be involved. You have to be engaged. But if you think that's what it's about, then it goes sour very, very quickly. You're meeting something. Because your child is not your object, right? Your child's alive. And you're meeting them. And when you see them and you look into, their eyes, you know that this game of self and other has limitations, right? That it's not just that, they're an other and I'm a me, that there's something else there. Even though it feels very clear that they're them and I'm me, which is also true. They are them and you are you. I think we can extend this to all kinds of things. The receiving and the doing always happening together. The self and the other are happening together. So a question in practice is, how do I harmonize this mystery? We can't grab onto this truth because it doesn't live in the realm of grabbing onto things. Right? Grabbing onto things is in the subject-object realm. When we understand something, when we say, I got it in the subject-object realm, it's, I grabbed onto it with my consciousness. I could tell you what it is, right? I'm sure of it. I know it. But mystery is just the opposite. Right? It doesn't mean there's nothing that could be encountered. It doesn't mean there's nothing that could flow through us. It doesn't mean there's nothing that could be known in a much broader sense than that kind of grasping. That's when we use a word like mystery. But how to harmonize that with that when we can't grasp it, right? In the world of subject and object, we grasp the thing, okay, this is what it is, this is what it's like, okay, this is how I'm going to do this to harmonize with it. It's that kind of realm. But here we're talking about something else. And breath is that mystery. Breath is deeply mysterious. Ungraspable. You can grasp it for a while. Cody Peterson, who was a member of our congregation for many years, and passed away last year, GK's wonderful husband. He was a diver, those kind of divers that don't wear tanks. And he would go down, and I was asking about it because that sounded really exciting to me. I love to swim. And a long time ago, I lived in Lake Tahoe for a summer job, and we would go out to the lake where that would drop off, and we'd try to dive down into the darkness as far as we could go. It was super scary and mysterious and fun. So he's telling me about it. I was so interested. And he said, oh, it's not hard. It's easy. It's easy. So you can hold your breath. You can hold your breath 5 minutes, no problem, or whatever. And I was like, what? I talked with GK later. She's like, he practices a lot. You sit and and hold your breath, learn to practice. But even someone like Cody, so strong and so vibrant and so good at this. Such a person who could put himself right there on the edge of things. 5 minutes. It's not very long, really, in the flow of things, to arrest something. So breath is mysterious in this way. It's constant, and its constancy is its mystery, that it keeps going, and yet it will respond to our consciousness immediately, to our doing, to our sense that we want something to happen. Boom, it's right there. No gap at all. So, to study the freedom that this breath is inviting us into is to become more and more acquainted with and more settled in the mystery, which is just the opposite of delusion. Delusion knows where things are and could tell you, this is this, that is that. Mystery can't tell us that. It can tug on our intuition. It can invite us to step forward, to inquire and to investigate. So with your breath, when we consider it within the path of practice, we should start with a deep appreciation. That's the correct way to approach a mystery, is with humility and appreciation. Not because it's just something else. It's not an other that is so powerful that we have to humble ourselves in front of it, but because it is so intimate to us that as long as we're looking out to identify and categorize, we'll miss it completely. So to bring an appreciation to breath is an invitation that can go out throughout every day, not only when you're sitting down in meditation, but meditation is a great place to study it so that you're providing that opportunity in your own way of regarding things so that that can also be present throughout your life. So you can investigate breath within meditation and outside of meditation, because when you go into it deeply in meditation, you're changing how it is that you regard breath. In a fundamental way, your perspective can shift. And then when you're walking around, you can remember that sometimes. And then a different things becomes possible. So this week, I'd invite you to begin that process of investigation of the breath, of inquiry into the breath, through this kind of appreciation. And I'm using the word appreciation really purposely here, rather than to say pay attention. I want you to appreciate it. The awareness that comes with appreciation, not hitting the target with an arrow. It's like, oh, it's here. Something's already here. It's constant. How do I appreciate it? Appreciate it with your body. Where does it move in me? To feel, when I sit down for meditation or other times, to feel like, what's this subtle movement that's always happening in my body? For those of you who have had the honor to be with other humans when they've passed, or animals when they're slipping through that gateway to another world, the stillness of the body is unbelievably profound. And there's another avenue of investigation there, but yours isn't that way yet. Right? Your embodiment has this constant. Right? So feel it throughout. I mean, you can feel it all the way down to your toes if you pay attention. That there's this wave, this movement. And then you can start appreciating the way that it shifts depending on what you're doing. Like you just go for a walk, or you're like, oh, I forgot this thing, I need to run over really quick. And do that. Do the thing you need to do, right? And then at some point this week, you're going to remember, oh, Ejo said appreciate the breath. Pay attention to your breath there. Notice how it's complete. It's cool. You want to do a little jog? Oxygenate the blood. Let's go. Woo. Your breath is completely present there, helping you do that. If you get a little more subtle in the appreciation, you might notice how it is when your hand moves away from your body, there's a tendency to breathe out. When your hand moves closer to your body, there's a tendency to breathe in. If any of you practice Qigong or Tai Chi or any of those types of arts, that's deliberately cultivated. Right? But you can start to see the way in which your movements and your breath, if you're doing something, if you have to lift something heavy, what will you do? You can feel it in your body when I say that, can't you? Mm-hmm. You can feel like what you would do. You know, lock in the core. Right? That's what my physical therapist tells me, lock in the core, right? But that breath is involved in that locking in the core. And then he's always like, yeah, lock in the core and keep breathing. I'm like, but I belly breathe most of the time because I'm a monk. So I have to learn to do that, lock in and breathe at the same time. So anyway, pay attention to that. And again, don't pay attention to it because you're going to now apply something to it. Right? That's not the point that I'm putting here. Pay attention to it as a mystery. Right? Pay attention to it as this kind of invitation, this kind of appreciation, attention that is expression of your appreciation. And then next week, I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that you can work with that purposefully. Any questions?
I was taught to breathe through my hara, which is the base, below the navel. And even though I know that my breath comes through my nose, I still feel it there. Is that wrong?
No, in fact, this is another example of how the breath will yield to our will immediately. So if we want to identify breath as coming over our nose, we can completely identify breath as being this movement of air over my nose. And in fact, in some schools of Buddhism, that's one of the places of deep awareness that people use for cultivating concentration, is to feel the air that moves over your nose. But if we shift our awareness to the belly, then we can feel that movement in the belly, or we can come to feel that movement in the belly, and we can identify breath as being there. And so most breath work is using that quality of breath, which is that it will correspond to our will immediately to inquire about something. I mean, the kind of breath practice that I'm interested in. There's some kind that use it to force through something, but to me, that's not. I think isn't. It could be skillful, but I don't understand the skillfulness of it. So, but I would really encourage everyone to not think that it needs to be in one place, but in that appreciation to explore where do you feel it, and then spread the awareness around to get a fuller sense of what's happening with the breath. One of the places that I think oftentimes comes as a surprise to people is your sides. Like we forget we have sides, right? We have fronts and we have backs. Some of us have bigger sides than others. But there's this movement that happens in the side of your body as you're breathing, this expansiveness that's happening there. And again, it's not like, let me feel it. Let me feel it. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting just stay with the breath that's there and feel subtly where it is, where it's going. If you feel like your breath is kind of a little rough, or it's making you a little nervous to pay attention to it, you can emphasize the out breath slightly. Sometimes when you bring attention or appreciation to your breath, it wigs out a little bit. That's the technical term. It kind of goes, wait a minute, he's paying attention. What am I supposed to be doing? And the breath starts asking that question, but you're not giving the breath any direction. Then the breath will kind of goes like an uncomfortable situation. I'm being attended to, but I'm not being demanded to. And we haven't really regarded, most of us haven't regarded our breath in that way very much. So there can be a little nervousness there. Then you just elongate the out breath a little bit, not forcing it, just slightly elongating it, and then let it flow. Let me put one last set of words in your mind that might be helpful in this exploration, and then we'll close. I've been reading a book recently by a man named Gerald May, who's a psychiatrist and a theologian, and he wrote quite a bit on the intersection between those two, particularly in the cultivation of a spiritual life, how psychiatric disciplines and investigations can be relevant in the spiritual life. And he wrote this book, I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but he uses these two words and he's exploring it throughout the book. And one is willfulness and the other is willingness. Willfulness and willingness. It's really, I found this a very useful dichotomy to help till the soil. What's the difference between those two? When I come at something willfully, which I have to do sometimes. I'm not saying willfulness is bad, but particularly in a spiritual life and inquiry into soul, that if we only activate the willful side, the doing, we get into some very strange places. And the balance between our ability to bring our intention forward, to apply ourselves to something, how that is me doing something, and how it is me showing up to meet something with willingness. Right? A willingness to meet what is there and then to try to do what is best out of the relationship that is uncovered from showing up. Is a different thing. So that's something while you're watching your breath, you can see how the way you appreciate your breath also corresponds with the way that you are in the world, in these things, what is willful and what is willing. This is a mystery.